Hello, and thanks for joining us today for ACI Learning's audit webinar. Have a question? Use the GoToWebinar question box and we will answer as many as we can at the end. Now let's get started.
Hello and welcome to the ACI Learning's webinar series. I'm so glad you joined us today. Today our presenter Robert Clark will be speaking on the Code of Ethics for Auditors, Identify, Apply, and Report, alongside Dr. Hernan Murdoch, ACI Learning Audit Instructor. Robert Clark is a nationally recognized industry expert in ethics, compliance, and internal audit with over 30 years in the industry. He currently serves as the University Chief Compliance Officer and Chief Audit Executive at Howard University. He holds professional designations as a Certified Internal Auditor, Certified Compliance and Ethics Professional, and Certified Business Manager. Now, Dr. Hernan Murdoch speaks at conferences in the U.S. and abroad and is the author of numerous articles and books on a variety of topics, including internal audit, fraud, and more. He holds professional designations as a Certified Internal Auditor and is certified in Risk Management Assurance. He currently serves as the VP of Audit Content at ACI Learning. Now, ACI Learning trains leaders in cybersecurity, audit, and information technology, delivering lifetime learning to over 250,000 engaged students, professionals, and organizations across 6 continents. Many of you attending today may know or may have heard of the MIS Training Institute, or MISTI. MISTI has been training auditors, risk and compliance, fraud, and information security professionals worldwide for over 40 years. MISTI is now part of and is being rebranded as ACI Learning. So check us out at acilearning.com and follow us on your favorite social media channels. All right, we'd love to get questions from you as we go along, so please put your questions in the questions panel in GoToWebinar on the right side of your screen. We'll be sure to get to those questions after the presentation. This webinar is also being recorded, and we'll put a link to the recording. It'll be sent to you within a week. And you can also download today's slides and any additional handouts by clicking on the links panel over on the handouts side. All right, now let's welcome Rob and Hernan to today's webinar. Hey guys, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Peter. Glad to be here.
Thank you, Peter. Nice to be here as well.
Yeah, okay, so we're chatting today about the Code of Ethics for Auditors. So where should we begin?
Well, I think, Peter, probably the first thing to do is to have a framework for what we mean by ethics and how is it that we as auditors actually have even a posture to be able to speak on ethics? Does that mean that we are trying to position ourselves as being pristine and without blemish? Well, if that's the case, then we might as well stop the presentation right now. We're not looking to, we're not actually in the position to try to convey and talk about auditing ethics from a position other than looking at the best interest of our organizations and what can we do in order to try to make sure that we are being seen as valued advisors and helping to ensure that our organizations are operating from a position of strength. So what I'd like to do is perhaps even start off with when we hear the term ethics, people can hear that term and throw a lot of different meanings into that. And what I want to do is just get a chance to give us a brief moment to kind of talk about the definition of ethics so that when we're using that term, we can understand the context of that. We've got folks from around the world who are watching this right now. And for all of my audit colleagues across the globe, welcome, and it's a pleasure to have an opportunity to spend the time with you today. And what we'll find is that sometimes when we're talking about ethics and cultural differences, those things need to be taken into consideration. But let's start off first with just a quick definition of what we mean in terms of the difference between legality and ethics. Legality is really just looking at whether or not an act is in accordance with the law. That's pretty easy to do. We can look at what the statutes are, the regulations in our particular area of the globe, and we can understand what the difference is between what is a legal act and what is not. But when it comes to ethics, that's really getting more into the concept of what's right and wrong. And who makes the determination of that? How do we determine what the standard is? We as auditors love to have standards against which we audit. And sometimes when we're talking about the concept of ethics, that becomes a little bit squishy, doesn't it? Well, one of the things that we want to do is really break down very quickly what we mean by some of the different concepts of ethics. Normative ethics is really just talking about how we arrive at the standards of regulating what's right and wrong. Oftentimes people use the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But actually, you hear a lot now about people talking about the platinum rule. Treat others how they want to be treated. And that certainly is going to differentiate or differ and vary depending on what culture you're in, what part of the country, what part of the world you're in. What's right for me might not necessarily be comfortable for you. So we want to make sure that we are understanding that. When we talk about virtue theories, that's really talking about just good acts that we would all expect to be benevolence, for example. Duty theories is really where we're talking about morality based on specific foundational principles of obligation. I think we might all agree that it is appropriate to care for our children, and it would be wrong not to do so. Consequentialist theories is really oftentimes where we as auditors live and interact with some of the folks within our organizations. And that is people kind of doing a cost-benefit analysis of what are the consequences? Is it better to ask for forgiveness than permission? And that is one of the areas that I think sometimes we find ourselves and people within our organizations actually crossing that line where they are doing a cost-benefit analysis saying, you know what, the consequences of doing something, well, there are no consequences, so I'm just going to do it. And we'll talk about what some of the structures that we can have in place and recommend to our organizations in order to strengthen that position. When we start talking about... Yes.
Rob, just wondering, as you are describing some of these different normative elements around ethics, one of the things that comes to mind is that it may seem somewhat theoretical or philosophical to some. When you really dig into it, I believe that some of the things that you're highlighting here have a very practical application. For example, when you talk about virtues, we talk about truthfulness and respect, and you mentioned benevolence. These are attributes of effective and desirable employees. So when you're recruiting, you're looking for some of these virtues. And when we're doing, for example, we're very familiar with, for example, T&E audits, when you're looking for temperance, and you know those kinds of dynamics associated with people's behaviors as they represent the company, we look for those. And of course, the ethics of duty, your responsibility as an employee, someone who's been hired to do a job. So there are definitely a lot of applications to what on the surface may appear to be philosophical and very conceptual. Do you agree?
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that point in, that we're not just talking about theory just for the purpose of trying to come up with definition, but hopefully, like Dr. Murdoch was pointing out, you can see how these apply to our operations. When we talk about actually applying ethics, that's when we start getting into the business ethics, which is examining the moral controversies related to social responsibilities of our businesses, what the moral status of our companies are, things like making sure that we're not involved in deceptive advertising or insider trading. Conceptually, we understand that those things are bad, but how well structured is your organizational ethical climate to prevent that or to mitigate against that particular risk? Other aspects of applying business ethics include things like whistleblowing and hotlines. In fact, why don't we actually get into talking more and less about the theory and about how we can actually apply some of these things. If we were to look at building an ethical organization, and if that is the mantle across the top of your organizational structure, well, that needs to be held up by a number of different principles. And one of those, I would suggest, needs to be your strategic goals, your written guidance. What do we mean by that? What are some of the components of these strategic goals? It is not just these strategic goals of where we want to be as an organization and our mission and vision and all of that, but really looking at what buttresses that. That's where we find issues like the organization's code of ethical conduct. Now, I know that we as auditors have a code of conduct with which we're expected to comply as a part of our certifications, as a part of us carrying out our responsibility. But the question here is for the organizations that we serve, the organizations that we're a part of, how clear is that? And the follow-up question is, do we have attestations and acknowledgments that people throughout the organization, especially those in key positions of leadership, are they acknowledging and attesting to their agreement to adhere to those codes of ethical conduct? And how often is that actually refreshed? So often I end up seeing organizations that, well, you have to sign off on your understanding of and agreeing to comply with your code of ethical conduct at your point of onboarding. What about the person who's been here for 13 years? Has there ever been an opportunity to refresh and make sure that person still agrees to adhere to that, particularly as the code of ethical conduct perhaps has gone through different iterations over the years? The other aspect of that strategic goals and the written guidance includes conflict of interest. Do we make sure that individuals, particularly those in areas of responsibility where there is the potential or perhaps the opportunity for somebody to be in a position of conflict or perhaps a segregation of duties issue, are we actually requiring people to do an annual attestation of a conflict of interest disclosure? The other element of that is talking about our policies and procedures. We as auditors love policies and procedures, don't we? Why is that? Well, it's because we ask for policies and procedures in order to try to fatten up our work papers and make it look like we really did a bunch of work, right? No, that's not why we ask for policies and procedures. We do that because they actually are intended to explain how the operation is supposed to work and to give guidance to the individuals in their areas of responsibility, and should also include, I would say, and it would be my position recommendation, that policies and procedures ought to be evaluated and examined through the lens of, do we actually say within the policies and procedures that the expectation for the employees as they're carrying out their responsibilities is to also ensure adherence to the code of ethical conduct? Are we tying that back in? Or is the code of ethical conduct just kind of hanging out there by itself and is never really referred to again? The principles of effective... Yes, Dr. Hernan.
So are you suggesting that we basically link the what with the how, so that we have the goals, we explain that, or the organization explain that to employees, and that it becomes very clear in terms of where we're going, mission, vision, and direction, and so on, but also in terms of what we need to do. And then the last piece that you highlighted was the how it's supposed to be done, so that the manner in which we carry out our duties becomes very central to this discussion as well, so that there's no discrepancy between the two. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, what he said. He said that so much more concisely. That was great. Absolutely. That's really what we're talking about here. It's not only the what, but it's the how. And conceptually, most organizations, if they were to go through and do a checkbox off of all of the required documentation that they should have in place, every organization is probably going to have a code of conduct, code of ethical conduct. But the question is, do they tie back to the day-to-day standard operating procedures, the policies and procedures that are followed and adhered to throughout the organization? If not, then what's the role that the auditor can play in that? Well, based upon the role and responsibility that we have for reporting, we can point out this as a potential area of risk. And we could point this out and offer this as a recommendation to our senior leadership, to our boards, and suggest that perhaps we have the opportunity to revise and enhance and fortify some of our existing policies and procedures and actually make that tie in. Along with that should be a sanctions policy, or there should be language within our policies and procedures that indicate the consequences for noncompliance with the policies and procedures. And the biggest issue that we find as auditor, check me if I'm wrong, colleagues who are watching this, is that oftentimes folks are just saying, well, there's no consequences for this, so I'm just going to do this. And again, it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission, and people are going to forgive me anyway because everyone does this all the time, and there's never anything that's done to actually enforce this. So where we as auditors can actually point out an opportunity to strengthen the position of our ethical environment at our organizations, that's one of the ways in which we have a chance to do that. The other area that is a part of that strategic goal, and as a part of one of the effective processes that I believe that every organization can put in place, is what to do when people find issues in which there are perceived or alleged areas of violation of ethical conduct or misappropriation. Well, Hernan, what would you think that people an effective organization would want to put in place for something like that?
I would think that an ethics hotline or some mechanism to be able to share allegations or concerns with management would be a very important tool to have in place as well.
I love that when you bring up something for which I have a slide. That's really cool. Because that's exactly what it is, right? We're talking about having a whistleblower hotline. Now, there's an organization called ECI. It's the Ethics and Compliance Initiative. It's a best practice community of organizations that are committed to the promotion of ethical environment. And in 2021, there was a study that came out. And within that study, it was on the state of ethics and compliance in the workplace. And they surveyed employees, and it showed that from 2017 to 2020, there was a 14% increase in the number of employees that indicated that they had observed unethical behavior or illegal behavior. That same study also indicated that 86% of them, of the individuals involved, indicated that there was a fear of reporting because of the fear of retaliation. So this idea that unethical and questionably unethical practices are going on, and yet people are afraid to say anything about it for fear of retaliation, there's data through this study to actually support that. So how do we deal with that? Well, we want to make sure, as Hernan said, that we examine an ethical climate in which people can actually report on that. What are the concepts of a strong ethical hotline? I was familiar with one organization where I had actually called to actually test to see what their hotline was, and just to see how they had managed that. And for that particular organization, I called, and the outgoing message on the other line was internal audit. That was it.
That was the extent of it.
That was it.
Wow.
There was no, like, thank you for calling. If you have a question, please report it, and here's how we're going to handle that. And for that particular organization, they were wondering, like, yeah, we never get any calls to the hotline. And I'm thinking, well, you probably get a lot of calls, but not a whole lot of people leaving messages, because that's really not helping them out. And if that study applies in the area in which you find yourself, then we need to consider that we need to provide every opportunity in which to present and in which to protect the anonymity and confidentiality of individuals who want to bring that forward. So what are the elements of an effective hotline that you should put in place, or that I would recommend that you put in place? First of all, have it as an independent third party, something that is not a part of your internal organization, where people might perceive that if I were to call that, perhaps the caller ID is going to identify me as being from this particular extension, and I'm reluctant to do that. Engaging with a third-party provider, making sure that it is going to be accessible through a variety of means, not just by phone, but through web and through mobile device, and to do so and have that available 24/7. As well as in multiple languages, not just assuming that the primary language in which you find yourself globally is going to be the language that people might end up reporting. And we'd actually implemented a hotline that has over 100 different languages that are available for people to be able to report on. Making sure that that hotline has a robust, secure system with incident tracking and the enabling of anonymous communication, which allows us to actually be able to follow up with and ask follow-up questions to the reporter should there be a need for additional information. It also allows for that ongoing dialogue, and we never know who that person is. All of that is handled through the third party, and it's 100% anonymous throughout. Internal audit.
One of the things associated with this, Rob, that I think is very helpful for our viewers also is that, as there may be concern about the identity of the caller, is that they'll get a case number. Mm-hmm. So I like what you just highlighted in terms of providing that extended communication over time, where if we are potentially doing an investigation and we just can't find a documentation, I've been in situations where the person actually has copies of documents, they have evidence that maybe the perpetrator has deleted on the company records, but the individual has additional evidence that we can use. And this provides a mechanism to communicate back and forth and explain that, number one, we're proceeding with the investigation, but we need additional help. And this provides that portal where we can continue the dialogue and perhaps move this forward. So I like what you're just highlighting there in terms of this feature that a lot of third-party providers can help us with.
Yeah, that's great analysis. I appreciate your perspective in that. And that is what we have found as well, that it enables us to, sometimes somebody is alleging that a perpetrator has actually deleted incriminating information, but that person has a copy of it and is able to actually forward that to us. Other things that ought to be, I know we're still talking about that one pillar, and this structure right now is a little bit lopsided. We'll go through the other pillars here pretty quickly, but this is really where we want to spend the bulk of our time, because this is the real essence of where we as internal auditors can have a positive impact. Other elements to this are that there ought to be an established triage system of knowing who it is that will be contacted in the eventuality that there are situations that are brought forward that might pertain to the responsiveness of HR or information systems or the CISO or your public safety, or, I mean, whoever it is that might be involved in that. Make sure that they are briefed on things before there's a report that comes in. The education and awareness that goes along with this in terms of promoting this out throughout your organization so that people understand how the hotline should be used, and it's not just a gripe line if you got what you perceive to be an unfavorable performance appraisal from your supervisor. Well, that's not what the hotline is for. We want to communicate that throughout the organization, and then making sure that the data and the trends are actually reviewed by the internal audit function in such a way that they can independently report on that, not just the numbers, but the trends of the types of issues that are brought forward, and include that to our board in our reports. Let's go back to our structure here.
Rob,
yes.
So as we were talking about some of these dynamics and your last comments in terms of things that can, that we need to raise awareness and things that can go wrong, how does this translate into risk and how the organization needs to think about it? Because in many organizations, they think, well, this cannot happen here. And that's probably a good way to think about risk associated with ethical breakdowns.
Well, that actually is a perfect segue into our pillar number 2, which is, again, the 5 essential elements for organizations, and that is risk assessment. So when we look at that second supporting structure, that's where we talk about enterprise risk management, identifying some of the areas of temptation. If we look at the fraud triangle with opportunity on one side, pressure or motivation on the other, and rationalization on the other, it's identifying, okay, what are those opportunities? Where are the potential pressures where individuals might be subject to increased pressure to try to, going back to that study, the data from that study to which I referred earlier. And then here is where we also implement the 3-line model and looking at and identifying who has the responsibility to do what in support of that. What can the auditor do in support of that? First of all, it's the coordination with all of those folks. Whoever is in charge of enterprise risk management, your compliance partners throughout the organization, internal audit, other stakeholders, pulling them together so that we have one common approach to evaluating risk. Certainly, there are going to be different nuances based upon the areas of specialization in the groups to which I just referred, but certainly internal audit has a chance to play a role at helping to try to ensure consistency of the identification of those risks. The next pillar that we want to talk about is, in the areas in which we can help to support our organizations, is in looking at the goals that emphasize ethical behavior. What do we mean by that? It's really talking about building and promoting ethical behaviors into the goals of the organization, into the goals of each unit, into the goals of each employee. So what are the roles that the auditor can play in that? First of all, I would suggest that you recommend to management, just like Peter Drucker, the consultant, said, you can't manage what you don't measure. Having this as something that is an expectation of every organization that you speak to as you are developing your strategic goals for the organization, mapping that back not only to the strategic goals of the organization within each unit, but also mapping that to the code of ethical conduct and saying that in the achievement of our strategic goals, in the achievement of our mission and our vision, we will make sure that we are also complying with and doing so in the spirit of the code of ethical conduct. And making sure that that is not just something that is a checkbox, but rather is measured. Well, how do we measure that? Perhaps measuring that based on the number of instances of questions or allegations that have come up through the hotline. That's where we as internal auditors can actually provide our data from the hotline and from the conduct of our regular audits throughout our organizations, where we can provide some of that trend analysis and data to the senior leadership in such a way that they can perhaps identify where there are opportunities to try to enhance that.
This is very helpful, Rob, because one of the things that has happened recently, well, in the last few years anyway, is organizations that have had very aggressive goals, and because they did not anticipate the potential for unethical conduct, the employees that were supposed to pursue those goals engage in unethical conduct, and it became very costly and damaging to the organization. So building ethics into our goals, I think, is a very important thing. And to your point, also having some metrics that we can refer to make sure we're on the right track. Now, one of the things that sometimes becomes troublesome in organizations is the assumption that all of these things are the responsibility of the auditors and the staff in the compliance department. Is there some expectation that to build a stronger ethical organization that we push that idea out that is everybody's job?
Exactly. And that's why I was making a reference to the three-line model earlier, that certainly there's a role for the auditors to play, but that's as the third line. It's not necessarily, I mean, if you look at where the primary responsibility for promoting strong ethical environment and behaviors and expectations, well, that starts at the top. And we're going to see, not now, I know there's a cue for somebody to bring up the COSO cube, not right now, but at the top of that, when we refer to it, we'll see the control environment. Well, that's really that layer of the organizational structure that we're talking about in terms of making sure that that is instilled at the very top, that there's the expectation for what the culture of the organization is going to be, and making sure that
Excellent.
that
Very
those
good.
goals.
Thank you. Appreciate that. So what is the next pillar? I'm very curious.
The next pillar is talking about the prevention of misconduct and actually working that into the job responsibilities. When is the last time that organizations have actually taken a look at their job descriptions? I know from my personal experience when I've been trying to do hiring in different organizations over the years that I have engaged the folks from human resources to say, okay, well, I really need to take a closer look at the job descriptions. And I'm looking at these saying, like, when were these done? These are referring to technologies that don't even exist anymore. And perhaps there's an opportunity to update these things. In the course of us updating our throughout the organization, when I say our, now I don't mean just the internal audit functions, but for throughout the organization, when we're examining our job descriptions, asking the question, is it detailed within the job description that there's an expectation for compliance with and adherence to the code of ethical conduct? Does it even make reference to that? And what I've found in the organizations that I've actually surveyed is that oftentimes it really doesn't. And what I'm suggesting here is, as those are done, I'm not going to suggest that the auditors say that, well, as an effort this year, we would suggest to senior management that they update every single job description throughout the organization and update that to include reference to the code of ethical conduct. That's kind of a heavy lift, because anytime you're updating job descriptions, that also means you have to go out and do market analysis, and that starts getting into the potential financial impact there. So let's be careful about making that type of recommendation, but rather to have the expectation that there is going to be the acknowledgement and maybe building that into the expectation of every employee throughout the organization, that on an annual basis, they must review and acknowledge and attest and agree to follow and comply with the code of ethical conduct, and making that a part of somebody's personnel folder, not just something that is held and examined by the person's supervisor. And then also working into the concept of a 360 evaluation. What do we mean by that? Well, for those who are unfamiliar with that, it's making sure that somebody's performance appraisal is not just conducted by the person's supervisor, but that you also involve the individual's peers and subordinates and everyone with whom that person might work, and get them as a part of that job performance appraisal, as a part of that feedback, get from people what the perception is of that individual's ethical behavior. And if people are then aware of and knowledgeable of and aware that people are going to be, the people with whom I'm interacting, it's not just my boss that I have to worry about getting a performance appraisal from, but it's all the other individuals with whom I interact, that might actually help to reduce that pressure from the fraud triangle and might actually help to reduce that motive and the likelihood that somebody is going to participate in something unethical because they know, that's probably going to come up in my 360 performance appraisal.
I like what you're describing because basically what it suggests is that ethics is everybody's job. We're all in it together. One of the things I recall early on in my career is how it was highlighted to me that when someone commits fraud, it's not just that they're stealing from the company as an entity, but from all of us as employees, as individuals, because those pay raises, those contributions to our retirement funds, those extra monies that are going to go into investment into the company, helping to reduce the cost of benefits, that money is being siphoned off by someone. So, and of course, you have investors who may be harmed by it and many other parties. So it is not a victimless crime. So it is very important to keep that in mind and to message that out to the organization that everybody is responsible for making sure we're ethical. And we want to make sure no one feels that they are safe doing it. We're all keeping an eye on each other, not to create a police society or culture, but we're all in this to try to lift the organization, and we are going to make sure no one is going to take actions that is going to be detrimental. So what other elements are important as we're trying to build this ethical organization, like the diagram and the structure you're building for us? What's the next element in this?
Well, the next element of this is just making sure that we are holding everyone accountable, and that it is not just that it doesn't just apply to the minions within the organization, but this applies to everybody from the C-suite level down. And that we are building in the expectation that there is going to be clear accountability and consistent application of disciplinary actions and consequences across the organization. So what can the auditor do in that? First of all, making sure in the establishment of our annual audit plan that we, in our risk assessment, that we are considering things such as reviewing the activities of the CEO, of the CFO, of other members in the executive cabinet and at the C-suite level. Because it's the individuals oftentimes I've found over the years that it's the individuals in the procurement system. They're the ones who are actually seeing what the CEO is trying to push through in the travel and entertainment portion of their budget. They're looking through and seeing how the individual at the very top of the organization is kind of fudging the line a little bit here in terms of what's appropriate and what's not. And that person then is aware of, really? So we're supposed to be keeping everyone else accountable, and yet the CEO herself is doing this, or himself is doing this, and there are no consequences for that? Well, how can we really, because that person is not the only one who's aware that that's going on. I can assure you. That ends up traveling through the grapevine. And so we need to make sure that there is consistent application of the level of accountability, and including that, there are organizations that I've been a part of where the CEO said, every year, one of your audits has to be that you review my budget and review my travel and entertainment and every aspect of my operation. That needs to be built into your annual assessment, because I want to have the tone at the top demonstrating that I am leading by example. And this code of ethics applies to everybody, starting with me. So if that is the culture of your organization, great. If it's not, then perhaps that's a way of enlisting the support of the board to say, you know what, in order for us to really establish this ethical climate for our organization and to ensure its sustainability, let's include this as a part of that. and then being consistent with reporting instances of noncompliance, and making sure that we are not just turning a blind eye to those activities. In fact, at one organization with which I'm familiar, in that organization, they were looking at their hotline activity, and 13 of the items that were presented actually involved the activities of that company's CEO. And so that gave the anonymous reporters comfort to know that they were able to bring visibility to these issues that they would have never wanted to just run up the flagpole without that built-in anonymity. And then the auditors, having the responsibility to actually objectively and independently verify and attest and investigate those issues, were able to actually point out some troubling trends and then bring that up to the board as a part of our reporting structure. That is a part of that.
Well, this is very good, because one of the things we want to avoid is anyone having the idea that they can act with impunity. So the rules apply to everyone from the top to the bottom, and everyone needs to act ethically, and that is part of the culture of the organization. So as we're looking at the pillars and the structure that you're walking us through, what's the next element, what's the next component that we should keep in mind as we're helping to support an ethical environment in organizations?
Well, I'm going to use that term support because the pillars of this are only going to hold up the banner on the mantle of the ethical organization if they are on a strong foundation. If you build your house on sand, it's not going to be it's not going to be sustainable. So building that structure, well, what are some of the elements at the bottom of the structure? The first thing that we need to do is include training and education as a part of this. Now, whose responsibility is that? That I would say is a shared responsibility. Part of what we want to do as internal auditors is make sure that we're leveraging our reporting structure, the visibility that we have throughout the organization, partnering with strategic partners throughout the organization, such as compliance, such as human resources, such as those who have responsibility for whether it's Title IX compliance, discrimination types of investigations, et cetera. Those who have an opportunity to look at this thing collectively, partner with them and ensure that there's training and education and awareness as a part of that foundation. The other element is monitoring. And that is, again, going back to, I was making reference to the three-line model earlier, who is responsible for monitoring to make sure that this stuff happens? If an organization is only relying upon internal audit or compliance, or let's just say internal audit, to actually be the monitors for that, then you have an organization that is probably not paying as close attention to the sustainability of these principles as they possibly can. And now here's where I want to actually have us take a look at how this fits into the COSO cube and the framework for that. Look at this diagram, and now let's have an opportunity to look at the COSO cube and see how this kind of plays into it. So if we look at the various elements of this, we're not going to spend time going through this. This would be a whole webinar just on the COSO framework. But if we look down at the bottom of this cube, and I kind of refer to it as like the game of Jenga. If you're unfamiliar with that, it's the blocks that you try to take out and put on top and try to grow it. When you're playing Jenga, you don't ever start at the bottom and take away the foundation. The whole thing will topple. Well, just as in that illustration, the monitoring is something that absolutely has to be in place. So if we go back to our structure that we were building and look at the monitoring down at the bottom of this structure, that's really what we're talking about. That the foundation of all of this is that you can have all of these different principles in place. Yes, you can have the written documentation. You can have the 360 evaluations that are worked in. You can have ongoing assessments of what your ethical climate is. But if you're not monitoring that, and if you're not ensuring that that is sustainable, then it is just a paper exercise. And I would encourage us to look at ways and actually evaluate as auditors, how well is this type of structure being monitored? Or is this just an obligatory checkbox that people go through on an annual basis? But now we have something where perhaps we're going to have a leaky roof at the top of this structure, because if we're going to protect that banner of the ethical organization across the top that's supported by all of these pillars and elements of the essential elements of effective organizations, and if we have training and education and we have monitoring, well, we need to put a roof on it. And that's where we're talking about celebrate and recognize. Now, here is where we have an opportunity to, the best way to summarize this is really to talk about it in terms of the carrot or the stick. How are we trying to promote an ethical environment? Is it by trying to bring public humiliation to and acknowledgement of those who have been found guilty of violating the ethical principles? And we're going to try to make an example, and we're going to string somebody, up the flagpole and make sure that everyone knows that you're going to get in trouble if you do this. Okay, well, that might be, that scare tactic might be effective to some degree. What I've found in the studies that I've read and looking at organizations that have really helped to change the culture of the organization is when they celebrate, is when they recognize, perhaps even as a part of the 360 evaluation, those who scored highest as having been recognized for adhering to the highest ethical climate within the organization, and actually celebrating those individuals, recognizing them, holding them up as examples. Because if they have been recognized by their peers and subordinates and supervisors as being models of that, well, chances are it's others throughout the organization that have also been aware of that too in their interactions with that person. And then why would we not then want to take the opportunity to provide recognition for that and to celebrate that? Certainly there are opportunities to learn from examples of those who have violated that. And I've always said never lose the opportunity to capitalize on a good crisis, whether that's a cybersecurity incident or a fraud or misappropriation, or incidents where individuals have blatantly violated the code of ethical conduct. Well, you certainly want to take advantage of getting the message across, but let's not let that be the only means by which we try to communicate and help to influence change. Because after all, we as auditors have the very unique ability, the trusted position to actually be agents of change, for us to actually be a voice piece for the things that organizations can do in order to strengthen the position throughout the organization. So I hope you get some sense that maybe you get one or two things out of this that you're thinking, well, perhaps in my organization, I can begin to think about how we might apply some of those things.
I really like how you summarize all of these different elements, and I also liked how you want to end with that positive note as well, because quite often we look at it as we have to punish the people who are not complying. There's a positive angle to this, and I think it's very important to also push that message out that we see ethics as a very good thing, as a positive thing. It can help to grow and enhance the organization. Therefore, we should also make sure that we look at it from that perspective and not only perpetuate the view of auditors as being the angry people who are compelling certain behaviors, and you don't want to make the auditor angry. So I like that perspective on it. So thank you very much.
Well, we want to make sure that that folks are not viewing us as the people who come in after the battle's over and bayonet the wounded, right? I mean, we want to make sure that we are seen as valued advisors, and if we're going to achieve that goal, if we're going to be seen as that strategic thought partner with senior management and with senior leadership, we have to change our mindset of getting out of the gotcha mentality. And we have to look at ways in which we can identify potential areas of risk and then figure out how can we proactively address that.
All right, thank you, Rob and Hernan. To our viewers, if you have any questions, be sure to enter them now in the chat panel on the right side of your screen. And before we get to the Q&A, I'd like to tell you just a little bit about Audit Pro TV. Audit Pro TV is subscription-based, on-demand audit training that's effective and engaging. A one-year subscription costs less than a 3-day classroom course, and it allows you to gain access to the training you need at any time from anywhere. Visit acilearning.com to learn more about Audit Pro TV and to get a free trial. And Hernan, am I right that in-person classroom training is coming back this December, I believe, right?
That's right, Peter. We are really excited to announce that this December, we're offering a week of in-person training classes in Orlando, Florida, right next to Disney World. If you're eager to get back to live classroom training, network with professionals, and earn up to 40 CPEs, then this is the perfect opportunity to do just that. Whether you're looking for a 2, 3, 4, or 5-day course, or wanting to pair two together to make a full week of training, we have something for everyone.
Fantastic. Well, if you're interested in learning more about the Orlando Training Week coming this December, now is the time to register before the classes fill up. Visit acilearning.com and contact us today. All right, let's see what questions we have, Hernan. I know we've got a lot coming in there.
Yes, we do. So let me mention the first one. Let me just read it out. So a question from Edgar. He says, when we talk about if the code of ethics is clear, which should be the right approach or strategy in a company that has employees with high qualification and employees with low education levels. So you have this bifurcation between high qualifications and employees with low education levels. How should you handle that when it comes to the code of ethics?
Well, that's a great question. And who is that from? Edgar? Is that?
That's correct, yes.
Edgar, thanks for that question. And next question. No, well, I'll answer that one. I think the way of trying to deal with this is that our code of ethics ought to be, the question is, what is the right approach and strategy in a company that has employees with high qualifications and low education? We need to make sure that our code of ethical conduct is communicated in a way that everyone within the organization understands that. And that's a part of what we were referring to as the part of that bottom foundation in terms of the training education. We want to not just put out a written policy, post it up on our website, send people an email that has the link to it, require them to go out and sign it, and then fill out some attestation sheet. We want to make sure that we are getting the message across to the individuals throughout the organization at their level, communicating in a way that the receiver is going to understand, not just in a way that the communicator and the presenter feels comfortable. So we really need to look at it. How can we get this message out to everyone within the organization? And if reading skills are not necessarily a part of the expected skill sets of individuals, well, then that's where the education and awareness comes in, and training and communicating this at the level where individuals are going to be able to understand, comprehend, and agree to follow those.
I agree with you, and I think that the language that's used, sometimes it is so technical, maybe too legal in terms of its tone, can be very confusing. And of course, the language in which it is written can be very important to help people better understand it. So thank you very much for that answer. I think it's helpful in many respects. I have a question from Rabab, and he's asking, how can management verify that the race issue related to unethical conduct that was observed by one employee is going to also result in keeping the employee confidential at the same time? So I think that the heart of the question has to do with confidentiality and protecting the identity of the person who's raising a concern. So what are some of the ways to do that?
Well, I think that's a great question. And getting back to that ACI study to which I referred earlier, this question is 86% of the individuals who had identified that there was something that they had concerns about were afraid of reporting because of fear of retaliation. So maintaining the confidentiality and anonymity of individuals as they report items is absolutely critical. Now, depending on in what country you are and what the laws are, there might be some limitations as to the degree of confidentiality that we can maintain if, in fact, there are suspicions of criminal activity where somebody could be in harm's way. But there are, thankfully, those are rare instances. In most cases, we will be able to actually assure the person, the reporter, that their confidentiality and their anonymity will be maintained throughout the process. And that is something that is addressed in policy. That's addressed in how we actually put in place our hotline reporting structure. Well, what if somebody ends up coming up to us as internal auditors and does not necessarily choose to go through the hotline, but they want to bring issues up to us directly, or just knock on our door, or or stop us in the cafeteria and say, hey, can I talk to you about something? I've got something that I'm concerned about. Well, we then need to make sure that we are maintaining that same level of confidentiality throughout the entire process. So that is really handled more initially by policy, but then in practice, how we facilitate that.
All right, I want to mention real quick, Hernan, before we get to the next question. I know a couple of people have written in that they're having a little bit of difficulty seeing us right now. They can hear us just fine, it sounds like. I want you to know this is all recorded, and we will send out a link to this recording to everyone who has attended today. Don't worry about that. What we're actually doing is sharing our webcam, not sharing our screen, so that's where a little bit of the confusion may lie. But apologies to anyone that's having difficulty, but luckily you can still hear these questions and answers. So, Hernan, why don't you give us the next question?
Sure. Another question coming through, this one from Nebojsa, asking about a dilemma. Should you audit some ethical behaviors or global ethics in an organization? So it appears to me that this has to do with how do you scope an ethical audit? Do you just, or the work that you're doing, are you just looking at specific ethical behaviors, maybe the result of an allegation, so a very tactical approach, or do you audit global ethics in an organization? So what should the scope of your review look like?
To that question, I would say yes. We should do both. Part of what we're trying to establish here is that framework. If you're thinking of it in terms of that organizational structure that we just had a chance to kind of build together, that's where we address ethics at the global perspective, from the organization standpoint, and then from that establishes the framework and the expectation, and perhaps even the procedures that are followed by the internal audit team in actually conducting investigations into allegations of unethical behavior, I should say. So it's really looking at both. It's looking at things where the auditor can actually add value in the process of establishing or recommending some policies, procedures, practices, some strategies that are going to help to fortify the ethical environment at your organization, as well as having the policies, procedures in place to be able to figure out how to investigate allegations of those. And then figuring the approach is going to be different for both. So if the question is coming up, how do we as auditors actually include some portion of our annual audit plan and those hours to actually helping to focus on where there would be the largest return on investment, I would say we start at the top with actually looking at what the structure is for the organization. How well are those principles being communicated throughout the organization? That's probably the best place to start, and then start getting down into the particulars of particular issues.
Great, thank you very much. That's very helpful. Another question asks, if there is a missing code of ethics, how to audit ethical culture in such an organization? So I suppose this goes back to one of the common practices within audit, which is we need to know the criteria before we can go ahead and do the audit. So if there is no code of ethics, if we were to treat that as the criteria, then how would you go about doing it?
Yeah, that's a tough one. If your organization has not yet embraced the establishment of a code of ethical conduct into its vernacular, into its primary documentation, what do? Right? Well, chances are we can get there by looking at what are some of the compliance obligations that your organization has. What are some of the laws and regulations with which you are expected to comply? And then looking at those particular standards, those regulations, those statutes, and chances are embedded within those legal and regulatory obligations is some reference to a code of ethical conduct, or ethically that we will conduct this in an ethical manner. It's a process of looking through all of the different regulations with which your organization is required to comply, and then saying, here's something that actually mentions ethical conduct in there. So that, by virtue of the fact that we are obligated as an organization to comply with this principle, we as auditors can then extract that and say, well, here is where it demonstrates that in order for us to be in compliance with this particular regulation, we have to do so in an ethical manner. It's in there someplace, I can almost guarantee. And you just have to kind of go digging for it.
Great. Thank you very much. That's very helpful. I found also that looking at the values, if those have been communicated, can also provide some insights into what the expectations are. But you're right, it can be very difficult. And I appreciate that question as much as you did too, because that's definitely a very tough one. One thing I'd like to raise is one that Ursula brought up. Says still on the first pillar. Wouldn't you agree that clear and strict protocols of how to handle what comes in through a whistleblower hotline and the transparency within the organization about such matters are also an essential component to build credibility for the system within the organization? So, having those protocols in place, how would you expand on that and help Ursula in this regard?
Yeah, absolutely, Ursula. That's a great question because the best way to completely torpedo the confidence that individuals have with the utilization of a hotline is to, number one, not be transparent into how you're actually handling these things and to mess up an investigation and have somebody's anonymity not appropriately protected. And that news is going to travel faster than any PR notice that you could put out on your company's website. So we absolutely need to make sure that we have the protocols in place as to how we are going to handle these things and who is going to do what, and to make sure that it is well established as to the roles, responsibilities for each person involved in that triaging that, to which I referred earlier, and making sure that we are communicating that to individuals so that people understand exactly how the process works. We don't necessarily have to go into the entire process of how the sausage is made because that could be a little bit messy, but we do have to at least be able to make sure that people have confidence in the fact that there is a well thought out structure and that it has been reviewed and vetted by the higher ups within the organization and it has been supported by the senior level of the organization. That's why I would suggest that as a part of the communication strategy, that of the implementation of a hotline, that not go out from the internal audit department or the compliance department, but that actually goes out under the signature of the CEO or perhaps even of the chair of your board, some senior level individuals so that people can see that this is something that is valued at the highest level of the organization so that people know that that's where it is championed.
Great. Thank you so much for that answer, Robert. And thank you, everyone, for your questions. We've run out of time here for this webinar. So for Robert Clark and Hernan Murdoch, I'm Peter Van Rysdam. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you back here again very soon.
Thank you very much.